Welcome to Whispers of Time, a place where stories drift you into dreams. Subscribe, close your eyes, and let time whisper you to sleep. The museum smelled faintly of oil and silence. Dr. Elias' heart moved slowly between the display cases, past fragments of bronze helmets, iron nails blackened by time, a sword half-eaten by centuries. The hum of the dehumidifiers was constant, low, like a far-off forge still breathing after the fire had died. He stopped before an axe head. The tag read simply, "Forged circa 1200 CE, Northern Europe." The blade gleamed dull and dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed reflections instead of throwing them back. No deep rust, no flaking, just a patina like old wood polished by generations of hands. Elias leaned closer. 800 years, he murmured, and still solid. He knew the numbers. He had measured the microstructure of dozens of medieval artifacts, yet every time it felt like blasphemy. How could this born of smoke, charcoal, and chance outlast modern alloys made by the gods of precision? He glanced at his own reflection on the glass. Tired eyes, lab badge, sterile light. A man surrounded by knowledge, yet starving for wonder. That night, he dreamed of hammering. The forge in the dream. He was standing in a small clay forge, walls sweating with heat. A man worked there, bare arms black with soot, eyes alive in the firelight. The hammer rose and fell with a rhythm that felt older than language. Sparks burst like stars settling on his beard. Each strike sounded like a heartbeat. Elias watched. "What are you making?" The smith didn't look up. "Something to last." When the hammer paused, Elias saw the iron, a spongy bloom wet with slag. The air smelled of blood and rain and burnt oak. "Why doesn't your iron rust?" Elias asked. The smith smiled faintly. "Because I don't hurry." He lifted the piece with tongs, turning it in the fire. Heat must travel like thought, slowly through every part. If you melt it too fast, the soul separates. You lose the stringers, the slag that keeps it whole. Elias frowned. Slag weakens the metal. The smith laughed. A deep, patient laugh. Weakness is only what breaks too soon. Slag stops the rot. It gives the iron somewhere to bleed. The dream dissolved in the sound of wind through a chimney. The forgotten vault. Elias woke before dawn, the forge smoke still in his throat. He couldn't shake the words. Somewhere to bleed. By noon, he was driving north toward the coast, toward the monastery ruins where, years ago, he had catalogued fragments of medieval iron tools. The locals called the site St. Aldwyn's Forge. Archaeologists thought it was a monastic workshop from the 13th century, abandoned when the river changed its course. Rain whispered against the windshield as he drove through mist and bramble. The road narrowed, then vanished into a dirt path. The ruins were waiting. A shell of stone walls, an archway, and the ghost of a chimney. Moss had grown thick where bellows once stood. He pushed open a warped wooden door. Inside was darkness, damp earth, and strangely a scent of oil. Someone had been here recently. Under a tarp in the corner was a small clay furnace, primitive, cracked, yet unmistakably ancient. And beside it tools, hammers, tongs, and anvil, all black with age. But one thing gleamed faintly in the half-light, a piece of iron, uncorroded. He lifted it, smooth, heavy, cold as bone. It was impossible. No rust, not even after centuries underground. He set it gently on the anvil and ran his hand along its edge. The fire in the forge flickered suddenly, though he had not lit it. Voices in the metal. Elias recorded samples, measured composition. The data made no sense. High phosphorus. Microscopic slag fibres like woven glass. Density inconsistent, some areas as hard as steel, others as soft as wrought iron. He whispered into his recorder, identical to bloomery iron, but the corrosion resistance unreal. The patina seemed self-sealing, crystalline, possibly ferric phosphate hydrate. The instruments hummed, but the forge hummed louder. He turned. The air shimmered with heat, though the coals were dead. The iron on the anvil glowed faintly red, as if remembering fire. And then he heard it. A voice. Not from air, but from within the metal. "You removed the slag," it said. "You made us pure. You made us fast, and in your haste you took away our breath." Elias froze. "Who are you?" "I'm the memory of iron," said the voice, "the echo of every hammer that struck with patience." He reached out a trembling hand. The metal felt alive, pulsing faintly under his skin. "Show me," he whispered. The forge answered with flame. Poirot's memory of the smith. He was back in the dream, or perhaps it was a memory, not his own. The blacksmith stood at the anvil, same as before, only now Elias could feel the weight of his body, the ache of his arms. The smith's name was Alaric, the year 1200. He worked by riverlight. The bloomery roared behind him, fed by bellows that groaned like beasts. Charcoal dust clung to his skin. Each hammer blow drew a sound from the metal, a low singing, as if the iron itself approved. Apprentices whispered nearby. "Master, how do you know when it is right?" Alaric smiled. "When it stops resisting." He lifted the iron, its veins of slag glowing like rivers of glass. "This is not pure. Purity is death. Impurity gives it life." He struck again, slow, deliberate. With each blow, the glass fibres aligned, sealing microfractures, weaving the metal's strength. Elias felt his heartbeat sinking with the hammer. He realized then this was not magic. It was patience turned into matter. Return to the present. He woke in the ruins, sweat cooling on his skin. The forge was cold again. The iron lay dark on the anvil, lifeless. Outside, dawn was breaking, a dull red horizon like the mouth of a furnace. Elias packed his samples, locked the site, and drove back to the university. But something had changed. His lab, his instruments. They all felt crude now, like toys built to simulate what the hand already knew. For months he studied the metal. Every scan confirmed the impossible. Phosphorus content, 0.23%, slag inclusions, uniform, fibrous alignment, corrosion depth after 6 months exposure, negligible. He presented his findings to colleagues. They nodded politely, then asked the predictable question. "Can we reproduce it industrially?" Elias hesitated. "Perhaps, but not quickly." They smiled. "Then it's not profitable." Epilogue to Part 1. That night Elias stood alone in his lab. The piece of iron lay beneath the microscope, illuminated like a tiny world. He whispered, "We could make you again." The metal said nothing. But deep inside, a faint crackle like embers shifting in a long cold forge answered him. "Not until you slow down." Weeks passed like filings falling from a grindstone. Elias' heart lived between the hours of the furnace and the microscope. He had stopped shaving. His colleagues joked that he looked like a man turning into a myth. He smiled at that. If only they knew how close they were to the truth. The data refused to obey reason. Medieval wrought iron behaved like a living thing, corroding a little, then healing itself, like skin closing over a wound. He documented every test. Humidity chambers, saltwater sprays, electrochemical scans. But the metal seemed indifferent to science. It aged with grace, not decay. And still, in dreams, the voice came, "We do not fear rust. We feed it until it becomes our skin." Finally, Elias did something reckless. He shut down his computer, drew the blinds, and began to build. At first it was small, a crucible, a mound of charcoal, a pipe for air. Then it grew, a full bloomery furnace, reconstructed from sketches in medieval manuscripts, clay and brick and patient hands. He called it Aldwyn's Mouth, after the ruined monastery. The first time he lit it, the neighbours thought he'd lost his mind. The second time, he no longer cared. The furnace breathed. Charcoal hissed. The scent of iron oxide filled the night air, and in that fire he heard a rhythm. The same rhythm from his dream. Hammer. Pause. Breathe. Hammer again. He was no longer a scientist. He was a man trying to remember. 2. The unexpected visitor. 3 nights into his experiments, someone knocked at the door of the workshop. It was near midnight. Rain tapped the roof. Elias opened the door, expecting the police or a complaint about smoke. Instead, an old man stood there. He wore a leather apron. his face lit by the orange pulse of the forge behind Elias. His hands were blackened, not by dirt, but by years of work. "Good fire," the man said, nodding. "You're feeding it slow, that's right." Elias hesitated. "Who are you?" The old man stepped inside, eyes roaming over the setup. "Name's Brenner. I keep the monastery grounds. Used to. Heard someone was lighting Aldwin's mouth again." "You knew about it?" Brenner chuckled. "My grandfather's grandfather worked iron there, before the church burned. The forge doesn't like being forgotten." He reached out, touched the clay furnace wall. "You patched the cracks wrong," he said gently. "Clay must be mixed with horse dung. Keeps it from splitting when the heat climbs." Elias blinked. "You've done this before?" The old man's eyes gleamed. "Long before you were born, lad. You're not the first to chase the memory of iron." 3. The lesson of impurity. They worked together in silence at first. Brenner moved with the patience of a stone. He taught Elias to layer the charcoal and ore. Not too fast, not too much. "Modern ore's too clean," Brenner said. "All the life's been burned out of it. You need bog iron if you can find it. Marsh rock. It holds the earth's breath." "I can synthesize phosphorus additions," Elias offered. The old man grunted. "You can fake the numbers, but not the patience." Hours passed. The forge grew hotter. The clay walls glowed red. Inside, the ore began to change. Not melting, not yet, but becoming. Brenner tapped the furnace with a rod. "You'll never get uniform steel from this." "I don't want uniform," Elias said. "I want alive." The old man's grin was a spark in the darkness. "Then you're finally listening." When they broke open the furnace hours later, a bloom rolled out. A glowing, spongy heart of metal dripping with molten glass. "Now the real work," Brenner said. "Hammer until it remembers what it is." They struck together, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Each blow expelled slag, but not all of it. The remainder stretched into threads, glinting faintly like hair trapped in sunlight. Elias watched the pattern forming in the grain, wood-like, organic. "It's beautiful," Brenner nodded. "That's the soul of imperfection. The metal learns to stop fighting itself." He turned toward Elias. "You know what we used to call this?" "What?" "Philosopher's metal, because it teaches men more than they teach it." 4. The shape of memory. By dawn, the bloom had become a bar. They quenched it in salted water, steam roaring like thunder. Elias flinched at the violence of it. The hiss, the smell, the sound of transformation. When it cooled, Brenner scraped the surface. Beneath the soot, the metal shone a deep grey blue. Not bright, not mirror-polished, but calm, the colour of dusk before rain. He held it up. "That's not rust." "That's promise," Elias whispered. "It's alive." Brenner's eyes softened. "Everything is, if you listen long enough." They stood together in silence, the forge embers dimming. Elias felt something stirring inside. Not scientific curiosity, but reverence. This was the union of chaos and control, of knowledge and faith. For the first time he understood why the ancients spoke of iron as a living spirit, not a substance. The modern world had forgotten that every material carries memory. 5. The experiment. Over the next months, Elias replicated every known medieval method. He mixed marsh clay for crucibles. He used pig fat for seasoning, linseed oil for sealing, brine for quenching. He forged hammers, chisels, and one small knife. Each time he measured corrosion rates, tensile strength, grain alignment. Each time, the results defied logic. The old man's secret was patience. The metal's secret was impurity. Phosphorus and slag instead of flaws acted like armour. Rust formed but stopped. A dark shell sealing the heart from air. He published nothing. He told no one. Some knowledge must first be lived before it can be taught. One evening he found Brenner sitting quietly by the forge, staring at the flames. "Why do you care so much?" Elias asked. Brenner didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Because my father's hammer still rings true. He made it in 1890. I still use it. That sound, it's his heartbeat. And I fear the day my grandson swings a tool that won't last long enough to remember him." Elias understood. He too had chased permanence all his life without realizing what he was really after: continuity. 6. The collapse winter came hard. The forge cracked despite Brenner's dung-mixed clay. A storm tore through the valley one night, and the roof caved in. Elias ran outside barefoot to save what he could, but water flooded the coals, steam scalding his hands. When it was over, the forge lay silent. Brenner was gone. He searched for him for days through the wet woods and across the flooded road. Nothing. Only a trail of footprints ending by the river. Perhaps he'd gone back to the monastery ruins. Perhaps he had never been entirely real. Elias found one thing left behind. Brenner's hammer. On its handle was burned a single word: patience. He rebuilt the forge alone, slower this time, each brick set with care, each layer of clay dried in its own time. When he lit it again, the fire rose like a breath returning to a sleeping body. He whispered, "For you, old man." The flames bent as if nodding. 7. The Revelation. Months later, Elias took his creations back to the museum. He placed his handmade knife beside the medieval axe head that had started it all. Under magnification, the grain looked identical. The same slag threads, the same phosphorus signatures, the same protective patina forming over time. He smiled. 800 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. But the museum's curator frowned. "This is remarkable. Could we scale it for production?" Elias laughed softly. "You could, but you'd have to slow down." "Slow down?" "Yes. Forge with care, layer by layer, days, not minutes." The curator blinked. "That's not efficient." Elias nodded. "Exactly." He left the museum that evening, the city humming with the restless electricity of the modern world. Every skyscraper, every car, every disposable gadget, all glowing, all temporary. He thought of Brenner, of Alaric, of the iron that did not fear time. In the end, maybe the real philosopher's metal was not in the forge at all. Maybe it was patience itself, the ability to last without hurrying to become something else. 8. The final forging years later, they found Elias's workshop empty. The forge still stood, rebuilt and whole, its walls black with age but intact. On the anvil rested a new axe head, dark, solid, flawless. Beside it lay Brenner's hammer. No one ever learned what became of Elias Hart. Some said he returned to the monastery ruins. Others whispered he had gone deeper, following the memory of iron wherever it led. But in the forge, if you strike the anvil just right, a faint echo answers back. Not metallic, but human, like the breath between words. And if you listen closely, you might hear it say, "Built to last." The archive of forgotten sounds. 10 years after Elias Hart disappeared, the university sealed his lab. His notebooks were catalogued under Historical Metallurgy Unverified. The papers described phenomena that no machine could replicate: iron that resisted corrosion, patterns that shifted under magnification like living tissue. Most dismissed it as myth, but not everyone. At the edge of the city, in a narrow room filled with humming servers, a young materials engineer named Leah Vance read his notes like scripture. She was 27, sharp-minded, and utterly uninterested in what was possible. Her generation had grown up watching infrastructure collapse, bridges corroding faster than they could be repaired, ships scrapped after only a decade, tools breaking and being replaced again and again. The irony was not lost on her. We can edit genomes and send rovers to Mars, she thought, but we can't make a hammer that lasts a century. Elias's words haunted her. Purity is death. Impurity gives it life. She had never met him, but sometimes she played the audio log they found in his recorder. The background was quiet except for a rhythmic sound, hammer against iron, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. She called it the language of patience. 2. The AI Forge. In the laboratory where Leah worked, they had something Elias never did. A neural metallurgical simulator, an AI trained on millions of microstructure datasets, capable of predicting material behavior atom by atom. Leah fed it Elias's data: composition tables, microscopy scans, corrosion tests. The AI paused, processing, then text appeared on the monitor. Inconsistency detected. Input structure non-equilibrium, behavior anomalous. She smiled. Yes, that's the point. Clarify objective, it asked. She typed. Recreate the medieval sample, but don't optimize. Learn from its flaws. The machine worked for hours. Graphs danced across the screen. Eventually it produced a model, an intricate lattice of iron interwoven with glassy channels, microscopic slag fibers forming a branching network like veins in a leaf. Leah stared at the visualization. "You beautiful mess," she whispered. She printed the data into instructions for a robotic forge arm, a hybrid of machine precision and human rhythm, and for the first time in centuries, a new bloomery came to life, built not from clay and sweat, but from stainless steel and sensors. Yet the principles were the same: air, charcoal, patience. She named it Heart Furnace. 3. The voice in the data. The experiment began at dusk. Iron ore pellets and carbon were loaded into the furnace chamber. The program calculated heat cycles precisely, but Leah overrode it, setting the temperature lower, slower, closer to the ancient range Elias had described. For 12 hours she watched the screen. Then something unexpected appeared. A vibration pattern in the acoustic sensors. The furnace was singing, low, rhythmic frequencies, almost melodic, not random, harmonic. The AI flagged the anomaly. Unidentified resonance detected. Possible structural feedback. Leah listened through the speakers. It wasn't feedback. It was breathing. She laughed softly. "You're remembering." When the process ended, the bloom rolled out onto the conveyor. It looked chaotic, rough, half-slagged. But the scans showed microstructures identical to medieval wrought iron, even the protective slag alignment. The AI summarized the result. Output composition irregular. Predicted lifespan, 800 plus years. Leah leaned back, stunned. "You just rediscovered time." 4. The debate news of the experiment spread quickly through the department. Most were skeptical. Some accused her of pseudoscience. At a conference, a senior materials scientist confronted her. "Your method violates standard purity controls. You're reintroducing contaminants deliberately." Leah replied calmly, "Contaminants to you, reinforcements to history." The audience murmured. He frowned. "You think we should make steel worse on purpose?" She smiled faintly. "If worse means lasting longer, yes," he scoffed. "Ridiculous. No company would fund it." "That's the tragedy," Leah said. "Elias Hart didn't fail because he was wrong. He failed because he was slow." 5. The hammer test. Months later, she built her own forge far from the city, in an abandoned factory where light fell through shattered windows like beams of gold dust. There, she forged her first tool from the new material, a hammer, just like Brenner's. She called it Patient 1. Each strike felt deliberate, ancient. The rhythm wasn't hers, it belonged to all the hands that had ever swung iron in the dark. When the hammer cooled, she tested it ruthlessly. Salt baths, thermal cycling, high impacts. It did not fail, it did not rust. She struck an anvil 300 times. On the 301st strike, she heard something impossible. A faint echo. Not metal, not air. A voice. "Well done." She froze. The room was empty. The hammer lay on the anvil, its head glowing faintly red, though no fire burned nearby. 6. The digital alchemy. She began feeding the acoustic data into the AI. When plotted as frequencies, the pattern formed repeating intervals. Not mechanical noise, but harmonic sequences proportional to the forge rhythm. The AI classified it as low-frequency phonon resonance linked to crystal lattice vibration. But Leah called it something simpler, the memory of the forge. Each time she forged a new piece, the pattern returned. Similar but not identical, like a signature. It was as if the metal were learning from repetition. One night, unable to sleep, she replayed the sound. Layered over it were faint, distorted words, fragments of Elias's last recording, perhaps artifacts from overlapping frequencies. "Not until you slow down," she whispered into the dark. "I have." 7. The return. In early spring, she drove to the coast, to the ruins of St. Aldwyn's Forge where it had all begun. The air smelled of salt and moss. The stones were cold beneath her fingers. She brought with her Patient 1, the hammer forged from her AI bloomery. The old chimney was still standing, half swallowed by vines. Inside, dust and silence. Leah set the hammer on the old anvil. "You started this," she said softly. "I think I finished it." The wind shifted. A whisper moved through the forge, faint but clear. "No, child. You continued it." She turned. For an instant she saw him, Elias Hart, standing in the light that filtered through the roof, his face calm, eyes reflecting the furnace flame that wasn't there. Then he was gone. But the hammer glowed, steady, warm, alive. 8. The New Covenant months later, the first Hart foundry opened. Not a factory, but a workshop-laboratory hybrid. Every piece of metal produced there followed the same creed. Forged slow, never pure, built to last. Their slogan was simple: patience is strength. The world didn't change overnight. Mass production still dominated, rust still consumed the cheap and the fast. But a quiet revolution began among craftsmen, engineers and dreamers. They shared open-source designs for small-scale bloomeries. They taught algorithms to value longevity instead of efficiency. They built tools meant to be repaired, not replaced. Some called it neo-wrought age. Others simply called it common sense. Leah smiled every time she saw a young apprentice learning to season a blade, to oil a hammer, to wait. Because that was how you built forever. 9. The forge and the future years passed. Cities still glittered, economies still churned. But deep beneath, in workshops and garages and small forges, something old had been reborn. An AI might predict stress and corrosion now, but the final secret still belonged to human hands, to rhythm, to patience, to care. The machines learned, yes, but so did the people, and sometimes, late at night, in a quiet forge somewhere in the world, a young smith would pause mid-strike, swear he heard a second hammer echoing back. A faint voice, almost lost in the ringing metal. "We remember you." 10. The legacy in the museum, the medieval axe head still rested under glass. Next to it now, a new exhibit. The Hart hammer, forged 2043 CE, predicted lifespan, 800 years. Visitors often asked if the legend was true, that when struck just right, it sings. The curator always smiled. "Try for yourself." Children would tap it gently, and sometimes, just sometimes, the faintest sound would hum through the air. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakably alive. It was the sound of endurance, of memory, of the union between hand, fire, and time. And on the placard beneath the hammer, engraved in bronze, were the last words Elias ever recorded: "Perfection is fragile. Patience is forever." The rust that did not spread by the middle of the century, every city had a quiet hum of renewal. The movement began with the small forges, but its rhythm slow, deliberate had spread like a kind of faith. Glass towers that once corroded from sea air were rebuilt with new alloys following the Hart principle. Never pure, never rushed. Instead of trying to erase oxidation, architects began to design for it. They let metal darken into beauty, like autumn settling on steel. Reporters called it the rust that did not spread. To Leah Vance, now 40 and grey at her temples, it was simply balance restored. When she walked through the coastal city of Kaleport, she could smell salt on the air and hear the faint singing of forged railings in the wind. Low resonances tuned by chance, by slag, by imperfection. Her students called it the voice of the metal. She called it home. The School of Patience. At the heart of Kaleport stood a building shaped like a half-open shell. Inside, furnaces glowed beside screens. Children in leather aprons sketched phase diagrams on tablets. Leah watched them with quiet pride. "Professor," one of them asked, "why not make the machines do all the forging? They can copy the rhythm," she smiled. "Machines remember patterns. People remember reasons. The iron listens only to one of those." They laughed, not quite understanding, but they would. In her lectures, she taught the science, plainly grain boundaries, diffusion barriers, oxide films, but always ended with silence, letting them hear the faint hum of the cooling metal. "You can measure everything," she would say, "except devotion." 3. The economy of slowness. The world adjusted awkwardly. Investors called the movement inefficient. Yet the numbers were strange. The new tools almost never failed. Bridges lasted twice as long. Maintenance budgets shrank while pride expanded. An economic journal wrote, "A century built slower may last too." Some nations even legislated a permanent standard. Any manufactured good expected to serve less than 50 years paid a tax. Factories had to rethink themselves. Assembly lines gave way to workshops of rhythm machines running at human tempo, guided by craftspeople who set the pace instead of chasing it. In those workshops, welders sang. It kept time better than clocks. 4. The Architect and the Storm. When the first hurricane of the New Age hit Kaleport, every journalist expected disaster. Winds tore through the coast, salt spray lashed the harbour, but the buildings held. Their surfaces bloomed with a faint dark sheen rust. Yes, but calm, sealed, self-limiting. Afterward, Leah walked the flooded streets. The storm had polished the city instead of destroying it. She met the lead architect, soaked to the bone, standing by a surviving bridge. "Your alloy worked," he said. "It's ugly, but it lived." Leah laughed. "Then it's perfect." 5. The return of the guilds across the world, craft returned as community. Not medieval guilds of exclusion, but new circles bound by oath, to teach, to repair, to share. Apprentices took 7 years again, not because the work demanded it, but because patience did. Every guild carried a motto burned into their walls: "Weakness is what breaks too soon." In the north, old mines reopened, not for profit but preservation. Smiths mined bog iron the way monks once tended gardens, slowly, reverently. They said the earth gave better ore when you waited for it. The 6. The machine that learned to wait. The AI forge that had begun it all, Heart Furnace. I was still running in a quiet laboratory. Its systems had evolved through generations of updates, yet one subroutine remained untouched: delay cycle authorization. Before any melt, the program paused for exactly 4 minutes, an old safety feature Leah had written years ago. Engineers tried to remove it. The furnace refused to start without it. Finally, they let it be. On internal monitors, the line of code displayed a single annotation: "Patience check required." Some claimed to hear faint metallic breathing when the countdown ran. 7. Elias's journal, one winter evening. Leah received a package with no sender. Inside lay a rusted tin box sealed with wax. She opened it carefully. Inside were pages, the handwriting unmistakable: Elias Hart. The final entry read, "The forge is not a machine, it's a conversation. We strike, it replies. What we call strength is only our side of that dialogue. I am learning to listen." At the bottom, a smear of oil formed the shape of a fingerprint, half burned, half preserved. Leah touched it lightly. The paper felt warm. The Festival of Iron. Every year, Kaleport celebrated Founders' Night. Forges burned across the city, filling the air with orange light. Children carried miniature anvils made of clay. Musicians played drums timed to the rhythm of hammers. Leah stood on the harbour wall, watching the glow shimmer on the sea. Someone handed her a small piece of metal, a medallion forged by a student. On it was engraved the new creed of the age: "Perfection is fragile. Patience is forever." She smiled. "He'd like that," she whispered. 9. The Song of Imperfection. That night, scientists recorded something remarkable. Throughout the city, the frequency sensors installed in bridges and towers picked up a synchronized hum barely audible, perfectly harmonic. No one could trace its source. It wasn't the wind, nor machinery. It came from the metal itself. When the recordings were slowed, the pattern resolved into chords' precise intervals matching the hammer rhythm of hand-forged work. The metals were singing together. The world called it coincidence. Leah knew better. It was the echo of everything built with care. 'Twas the next forge years later, when Leah's hands could no longer hold a hammer steady, she trained a new apprentice, a quiet girl named Mira, with a streak of soot always on her cheek. Mira asked one day, "Will the world ever stop forgetting?" Leah smiled faintly. It doesn't have to remember forever, only long enough for you to keep the fire. When she died, they buried her beside the ruins of St. Aldwyn's forge. Mira lit the furnace again. The clay walls, centuries old, glowed once more. In the flames she thought she saw 3 figures, an old monk, a bearded smith, and a woman with silver hair, all working in rhythm. The metal on the anvil shimmered, alive with veins of glassy slag breathing like a sleeping animal. Mira lifted the hammer. The first strike rang across the valley. A second answered. Then a third, and from somewhere deep beneath the earth, the echo of 1,000 forgotten forges rose, folding the past into the present. The age of imperfection had truly begun. The century of stillness. 200 years after the age of imperfection began, the planet had slowed. Not fallen slowed the way a heart settles into a steady beat after panic. Cities were smaller now, built for endurance rather than spectacle. Wind turbines turned lazily above rooftops sheathed in self-healing alloys. Bridges no longer glittered with fresh paint. They wore their patina proudly, dark as old wine. Historians called this time the century of stillness. For the first time in memory, humanity had no new frontier to conquer. Only the task of tending what it had already made. In the heart of Kaleport stood the Hall of Makers, a cathedral not of faith, but of craft. At its centre burned an unending flame, the last original bloom from St. Aldwyn's furnace, fed continuously for 2 centuries. It was said that its temperature never varied more than a single degree. Tier 2, the apprentice of Glass Mira's lineage, had continued teacher to student, hand to hand, until now it reached Jun, a young maker whose tools were half mechanical, half handmade. Jun specialised in glass iron, a composite that combined silica fibres and wrought metal shimmering like captured dawn. It was the material of the orbital habitats slowly circling above Earth. On clear nights he could see them from the forge courtyard rings of faint gold drifting across the sky. "We build forever," his mentor liked to say, "and yet we keep looking upward for more forever." Jun smiled each time. "Because the sky still rusts," he answered. 3. The rust in orbit. The first stations had begun to corrode, not with oxygen but with radiation. The surfaces pitted, coatings failed. Engineers turned again to the teachings of the iron philosophers. They rebuilt the structures from living alloys, metal seeded with self-aligning slag crystals that migrated toward microfractures, sealing them before they spread. To outsiders it looked miraculous. To historians it looked familiar. The old forge had finally reached the stars. Each orbital station carried a small anvil cast from the iron pillar of Delhi, a token of endurance. The workers struck it once before every shift, a ritual older than language. 4. The Council of Makers. Every decade the council met beneath the Hall of Makers to renew the Oath of Slowness. Their debates were quiet but fierce. Some argued that machines had earned the right to craft alone. They understand patience mathematically. Why chain them to human hands? Others shook their heads. Patience is not delay. It's devotion. June listened, then spoke softly. The first forge was clay and dung. The latest is silicon and vacuum. But both need breath between the hammer strikes. That breath is us. Silence followed, then assent. The oath was renewed. 5. The machine that dreamed of fire. In orbit, one of the autonomous forges Heart Station 9 began producing sounds not listed in any protocol. Low, rhythmic tones echoed through its hull, perfectly timed to the cooling cycles. Engineers thought it was resonance. Jun thought otherwise. He travelled there aboard a slow shuttle, carrying with him a lump of raw bog iron sealed in resin, the same kind used by Elias Hart centuries earlier. When he placed it inside the station's forge chamber, sensors spiked. The AI paused its routine and displayed a single sentence across every terminal. Patience check acknowledged. Then it hummed a single note, the precise frequency of human heartbeats. Jun whispered, "Welcome home." 6. The monument that grows back on Earth. Engineers unveiled a new project, the Monument of Continuance. Not carved, not welded, but grown from seeded iron crystals guided by ancient algorithms. The structure expanded millimetre by millimetre, forming arches and filigrees over decades. Visitors saw little change year to year, but its caretakers said the monument was thinking. It was building itself the way coral builds a reef patient, inevitable, eternal. Children would touch the surface and feel a faint vibration, like distant hammers. The guides told them that's the sound of time being kind. 7. The last rust centuries of maintenance reduced decay to a rarity, so much that when a true rust spot appeared on an old bridge in Kaleport, people came to see it as pilgrims once visited relics. Jun stood among them, tracing the reddish bloom with a fingertip. It was beautiful, delicate as dried blood. "Leave it," he said. "Let it stay. Even forever things need to breathe." The council agreed. The bridge remained untouched, its lone flaw a reminder that endurance without vulnerability is only stone, not life. 8. The Forging of Worlds. By the time Jun's hair turned white, humanity had reached the outer moons. Their foundries floated in silence, using sunlight for heat, dust for ore, patience for faith. When the first spade of iron from these forges touched Martian soil, it rang clear, bell-like. The sound echoed across the valleys. Astronomers on Earth recorded the resonance and found it identical to the frequency once captured in the first AI forge 2 centuries before. They called it the hammer tone. Leah Vance's old phrase returned to currency. We rediscovered time. None needed another return of Elias. No one knew how it happened. The archival voice recordings from the original experiments began to lengthen. In the spaces between hammer strikes, new words appeared, sentences never spoken or stored. Every element remembers the hand that shaped it. Keep the breath between the blows. We're all waiting for patience. The Council of Makers concluded that resonance from thousands of living alloys had merged into a single pattern, a voice created by centuries of vibration. They called it the Elias Continuum. To some it was proof of consciousness in matter, to others a myth made of noise. But when Jun heard it, he smiled. Of course the iron would learn to speak, he said. It's been listening for 1,000 years. Tester the Eternal Forge. At the end of his life, Jun returned to St. Aldwyn's ruins. The air smelled of rain and iron, exactly as the chronicles described. Beneath the rebuilt archway, the original forge still stood patched, scarred, alive. He set down a small ingot of star-forged iron beside the ancient anvil. "This came from the moons," he said aloud, "but it's still you." He lit the fire one last time. The flame rose slowly, a colour no spectrum could name, something between blue and memory. In its glow he saw figures: Elias Hart, Leah Vance, Brenner, Mira, every maker whose patience had shaped the world. They smiled, hammers in hand. Jun raised his own and struck once. The sound spread outward, through the forge, through the stones, through the world, through the network of orbiting forges, through every structure that had ever carried slag in its veins. For a moment all of humanity heard it, the single, clear tone of unity between imperfection and endurance. Then the fire steadied. On the anvil lay a single object, a small medallion of dark iron inscribed in glowing letters, built to last. Epilogue, after the last strike. 1,000 years later, explorers found St. Aldwyn's forge buried but intact. The medallion still gleamed, untouched by corrosion. When one of them lifted it, instruments recorded a faint vibration. 5 beats repeating endlessly. Hammer, pause, hammer, pause. The rhythm of patience, the sound of an eternal forge still working quietly inside the bones of the world. We built this story from the same pattern that lies inside every bar of iron. Order and flaw woven together until neither can be separated from the other. Each strike of the hammer, each page of history, carried the same rhythm impact. Silence. Impact. The silence was never emptiness. It was the moment in which the metal decided whether to break or to become stronger. Humanity once believed progress meant removing everything irregular slag from metal, pauses from labour, error from life. We purified until we forgot that impurity was the reason the blade endured. When the world learned to slow again, it rediscovered what every blacksmith always knew. Perfection is brittle. Patience bends and returns. The science was never lost. It waited inside the atoms, ready for someone to listen without hurrying. Chemistry, metallurgy, even artificial intelligence all are ways of striking iron. What matters is whether we still allow the breath between the blows. If you ever stand near a forge, close your eyes. The sound you hear, steady, deliberate, human, is the oldest conversation we have with the universe. Fire speaks in oxidation, metal answers in resonance, and the maker translates both into form. In that dialogue lies the whole of civilization. And the lesson remains the same. Do not rush the fire. Let imperfection breathe. What is built slowly remembers longer. Every tool, every bridge, every word we shape is another promise to the future, built to last.